have internet issues like last time.
No, internet is great over here, so it's not a problem.
Internet. Okay, Mataji, we're ready.
Hare Krishna, everyone. Glad to be back. And today we will be covering the 15th chapter of Canto 1. So, a little summary of what's been going on in the last chapter. You may remember in chapter 14, Yudhishthir Maharaj, who's now the king of Hastinapur, the emperor of the world, he sent Arjuna to Dwarka to find out what the next activity of the Lord was going to be. And after several months of Arjuna being away in Dwarka, Yudhishthir Maharaj saw many inauspicious things, such as dogs fearlessly barking at the king, crows shrieking, lightning appearing when there were no clouds. And by this, Yudhishthira Maharaj understood the demoniac characteristics of the age of Kali had arrived. And what were these qualities? Greed, anger. So these qualities can only be there if Krishna was not on the planet. So he was thinking that all these omens meant that Krishna had departed from this world. So he was lamenting. Just at that time, Arjuna came back, and that happened in the last few verses of the last chapter. Arjuna came back, and his face was dejected, and he was crying. He was not able to hold back his tears. And this was the great Arjuna that we've known earlier, in the battle of Kurukshetra, right? Finally, Yudhishthir Maharaj began to ask questions from Arjuna about the other members of the Yadu dynasty, about Balaram, about the queens of Krishna, and finally he asked the ultimate question, and that is whether Krishna had left for the spiritual abode. So in this chapter, which is called Pandavas Retire Timely, Arjuna begins to reply. And this is his reply. I'll read you a few verses from text 1 to 4, just to set the scene of what's going on. Suta Goswami said, Arjuna, the celebrated friend of Lord Krishna, was grief-stricken because of his strong feelings of separation from Krishna over and above all Maharaj Yudhishthir's speculative inquiries. Due to grief, Arjuna's mouth and lotus-like heart had dried up, and therefore his body lost all luster. Now remembering the Supreme Lord, he could hardly utter a word in reply. With great difficulty, he checked the tears of grief that smeared his eyes. He was very distressed because Lord Krishna was out of his sight, and he increasingly felt affection for him. Remembering Lord Krishna and his well-wishers, benefactions, intimate familial relations, and his chariot driving, Arjuna, overwhelmed and breathing very heavily, began to speak. So in our first slide, very interesting concept we're going to talk about, and that's in verse 5, how Krishna gives, but he takes away when his mission is completed. This is in reference to Arjuna, how he's feeling a loss because Krishna has left him. And with that, he's noticing how all his powers have also been taken away. Text 5. Arjuna said, "O king, the supreme personality of Godhead Hari, who treated me exactly like an intimate friend, has left me alone. Thus my astounding power, which astonished even the demigods, is no longer with me." And this idea is repeated again in later text, in text 21, where Arjuna talks about how the same Gandiva bow, the same arrows, everything that he's used them now is not effective anymore with the absence of Lord Krishna. So in text 5, Prabhupada explains that how Krishna comes with a mission and how he performs in different ways. He empowers his devotees in different ways. And he gives specific empowerment, and he gives it in different ways. And it's meant for a special mission. And then when that mission is completed, he withdraws it away. And we see that again, time and again, because here in Arjuna's case, we see it very clearly. But in other, I know in many other areas, especially as Krishna's incarnations, where he gives special empowerment for a special purpose, Krishna sends his devotee with that mission. And then that devotee goes back, to the spiritual world, and that potency is taken away. So Arjuna is feeling bereft of Krishna because he's realizing it's not like he's missing those powers, but he's realizing the greatness of Krishna. He's realizing how he's giving all credit to Krishna, first of all. He's such a great devotee that he thinks that, one would think after winning such a great war and dealing with such, powerful warriors, one would take some credit to himself. But no, here Arjuna, in the same mood we see later on in Yudhishthira Maharaj, how they gave all credit to Krishna. And whatever they had, they felt completely obligated to Krishna. They felt like it was not their credit at all. So Prabhupada explains that in the purport of text 5, how, Krishna, when he finds it necessary, he gives, but then those same powers are not required for going back to Godhead. You see, now the time was come where the Pandavas had to go back to Godhead. And so those powers were not needed for going back to Godhead, right? So one requires a different empowerment, but for the purpose, for the mission, but he doesn't require the same empowerment for going back to Godhead. One cannot smash death by great prowess, but by submission and feeling such intense separation from Krishna. In one of the earlier chapters, I discussed how, these devotees, they're feeling intense separation, and that's why they are so qualified to go back to Godhead. And that separation only comes with association. The more one has association of Krishna and his pure devotees, the more one can feel that separation. So therefore, the conclusion is, Prabhupada concludes in the purport, that how one should not be proud of what one possesses. That's the basic lesson that we can teach, is that we should not be proud of what one possesses, because Krishna, everything belongs to Krishna. It is like if you borrow a car, maybe it's a Mercedes or, a nice big car, then we drive in it for some time. But to be proud of that car and how it's foolish, because it's really not our car. So instead, we should use it in the service of the Lord. So if you have something wonderful, some material assets, some ability, some power, some knowledge, some fame or wealth, we should know that these qualities don't belong to us and will be taken away with a snap of a moment. And therefore, we should understand that our possession is so temporary. So we should use it for Krishna. So in the next slide, we will talk about, Prabhupada discusses something very interesting. So I thought I'll bring it out as a separate learning plan for our children, to understand how no one is dearer to us than Krishna. We just don't know it. And in this, Prabhupada, in his purport, talks about how without the soul, there's no body. Right? The body is dead, in other words. Without Paramatma, there's no soul. The soul itself owes its existence to the super soul. Without Krishna, Paramatma has no standing, and how we are all part of him, and he's our greatest benefactor. So Prabhupada writes in the purport, as a living being is the important factor in the material body, for without the living being, the material body has no value. Similarly, without Paramatma, the living being has no status quo. Similarly, Brahman or Paramatma has no locus standi without the Supreme Lord Krishna. They all interlinked with one another or independent factors. Thus, in the ultimate issue, the Lord is the summum bonum and therefore the vital principle of everything. And that is why Krishna is most dear to us. We just don't know it. So in our next slide, we will talk about now a series of things, a few slides on this, of how Arjuna remembers how he was helped by Krishna in so many different ways. Again, the idea behind it is how he's giving credit to whatever wonderful things he's done. And we'll see all the wonderful things he's done. First of all is Draupadi's Swayamvara. Text 7, only by his merciful strength was I able to vanquish all the lusty princes assembled at the palace of King Drupad for the selection of the bridegroom. With my bow and arrow, I could pierce the fish target and thereby gain the hand of Draupadi. So this is a very, very wonderful story of Arjuna's prowess that we can tell our children. And Prabhupada explains how King Drupad wanted to give his daughter to Krishna, that is Draupadi, and he made a fish contest. He hung a fish, and then the archers had to pierce the fish with the wheel turning, not looking directly at the fish, but rather looking at the reflection of the fish in a bucket of water. And only two people could do it, Karna and Arjuna. And then the story goes how she called Karna a non-Kshatriya, and so he could not take part because Draupadi wanted Arjuna as a husband. And this insult really affected Karna, which shows later on in the Mahabharata, where he tries to get Draupadi. Arjuna won, of course. He escaped with Draupadi and brought her home. And when he brought her home, he told his mother, from just even when she had not even seen them, that Mata, you should see what I have brought. And his mother said, what? Just share. And without knowing what exactly he brought. So that's how Draupadi ended up with 5 husbands. And she was the goddess of fortune. So she was not an ordinary person. So we should not look at it, of course, in a mundane way. So by Krishna's mercy, a wonderful wife was found. And Arjuna remembers that. And next slide, which is verse 8, Arjuna says Maya Danava. Text 8. Because he was near me, it was possible for me to conquer with great dexterity the powerful king of heaven, Indradev, along with his demigod associates, and then enable the fire god to devastate the Khandava forest. And only by his grace was the demon named Maya saved from the blazing Khandava forest. And thus we could build our assembly house of wonderful architectural workmanship where all the princes assembled during the performance of the Rajsuya Yagya and paid you tributes. So Prabhupada explains how the demon Maya Danava was an inhabitant of the forest Khandava. And when the Khandava forest was set on fire, he asked protection from Arjuna. Arjuna saved his life, and as a result, this demon felt obliged. He reciprocated by building a wonderful assembly house for the Pandavas, which attracted the extraordinary attention of the state princes. They felt the supernatural power of the Pandavas, and thus, without grudge, all of them submitted and paid tributes to the emperor. The demons possess wonderful and supernatural powers to create material wonders, but they're always disturbing elements of society. The modern demons are the harmful material scientists who create some material wonders for disturbance in the society. For example, the creation of nuclear weapons has caused great panic in the human society. Maya was also a materialist like that, and he knew the art of creating such wonderful things. So this becomes a very nice point of discussion with the children, how to see all these material inventions and things, if the purpose behind it is not good. You see, everything connected to Krishna is okay. Even our modern scientific discoveries is okay as long as we're connecting it to Krishna. Without that, this is what makes it demoniac. When we are hearing this, naturally we are thinking that one point that Prabhupada discusses here, that how Krishna gives to all his friends and to all his devotees. And we know that we have material desires, and even though we want to serve Krishna, but we still have so many desires. But by hearing these stories, we know that how when he becomes a pure devotee like Arjuna, there's no limit. All the demigods were envying him. And we see that throughout. Maharaj Yudhishthira's reign was very much envied by the demigods. So in our next slide, we talk about Draupadi's insult. Text 10. It was he only who loosened the hair of all the wives of the miscreants, who dared open the cluster of your queen's hair, which had been nicely dressed and sanctified for the great Rajasuya sacrificial ceremony. At that time, she fell down at the feet of Lord Krishna with tears in her eyes. Famous story. Queen Draupadi had a very beautiful bunch of hair, and which was sanctified in the ceremonial function of Rajasuya Yagya. Prabhupada writes, but when she was lost in a bet, Dushasana touched her glorified hair to insult her. Draupadi then fell down at the lotus feet of Krishna, and Lord Krishna decided that all the wives of Dushasana and company should have their hair loosened as a result of the battle of Kurukshetra. Thus, after the battle of Kurukshetra, after all the sons and grandsons of Dhritarashtra died in battle, all the wives of the family were obliged to loosen their hair as widows. In other words, all the wives of the Kuru family became widows because of Dushasana's insulting a great devotee of the Lord. The Lord can tolerate insults upon himself by any miscreant because the Father tolerates even insults from his Son, but he never tolerates insults upon his devotees. By insulting a great soul, one has to forego all the results of pious acts and benedictions also. So in our next slide, in text 11, we will see Krishna, how he rescues the Pandavas from Durvasa Muni's wrath. Text 11, Arjuna is saying, during our exile, Durvasa Muni, who eats with his 10,000 disciples, entreated with our enemies to put us in dangerous trouble. At that time, he, Lord Krishna, simply by accepting the remnants of food, saved us. By his accepting food thus, the assembly of Munis, while bathing in the river, felt sumptuously fed, and all the three worlds were also satisfied. So Durvasa Muni is a very famous Muni, right? And we know that he's easily pleased or angered. So when angry, he would curse, and when he's pleased, he would give benedictions. So this is the story of how Duryodhan wanted to give Pandavas trouble. So one time he pleased Durvasa Muni, and the latter offered benedictions. And Duryodhan was very cunning. This is the way of dealing with an enemy. You smile at them, and then behind the back, you devise ways to ruin them. So Duryodhan was typical of that. So he knew that in the afternoon, Pandavas would not properly take care of him because they would finish the meals. So he asked Durvasa Muni to visit the Pandavas in the afternoon. So then they were in the forest. All the Pandavas were exiled in the forest. And Draupadi had a pot that could supply unlimited food as long as they had not eaten. But once they had eaten, the pot would stop providing. So when Durvasa Muni came, they had already finished eating. And Yudhishthira Maharaj asked Durvasa Muni and 10,000 disciples to go and bathe in the river because that was his ritual before he would eat. And so that he would get time to see what they would do now. And Draupadi was he was very much worried and in tears, and she was thinking of the Lord, and she prayed to the Lord. And the Lord reciprocated. He asked Draupadi, do you have some food? And she was very ashamed because Krishna was asking her for food. And she just shook her head. And so Krishna went to this pot, Draupadi's famous pot, and there was one grain of rice stuck at the bottom, and Krishna eats that, and suddenly all these disciples and Durvasa Muni, they felt they were belching and they were so full that they were thinking, now what should we do? The Pandavas must have made such a big arrangement for us and we can't eat even one morsel. So they quickly left quietly because when Bhima went to call them, they had actually disappeared. So this is a wonderful story, and the children really enjoy these stories when you tell them. So in our next slide, from verses 12 to 19, Arjuna gives credit to Krishna for defeating the Kauravas. I'm not going to read the verses because we know this how, the Kauravas is explained in the Gita, how they were really very, very powerful. And there was no way the Pandavas could defeat them. They were all very Maharathis, they were called. I forget how Prabhupada explains a Maharathi, but Maharathi is somebody who can single-handedly take care of so many Akshihonis. It's like very, very powerful. And there were so many of them in that army on the Kauravas side. Whereas Pandavas, they were just the 5 Pandavas, the 5 brothers, and Krishna. But Arjuna, what he's thinking is that how he could have, it was not possible for him to defeat the Pandavas and the Kauravas. So Prabhupada writes in the pulpit, there were commanders like Bhishma, Drona, Kripa, Karna, and their military strength was insurmountable as a great ocean. And yet it was due to Lord Krishna's grace that Arjuna alone, sitting on the chariot, could manage to vanquish them one after another without difficulty. Interestingly, there were many changes of commanders on the other side, but on the Pandava side, Arjuna alone on the chariot, driven by Lord Krishna, could manage the whole responsibility of the great war. Similarly, when the Pandavas were living at the palace of Virat in incognito, the Kauravas picked a quarrel with King Virat and decided to take away his large number of cows. While they were taking away the cows, Arjuna fought with them incognito and was able to regain the cows along with some booty taken by force. Okay. So in our next slide, we'll talk about Arjuna defeated by coward boys. The Prabhupada explains in the pulpit how Arjuna had the mission of bringing the wives to Krishna to Hastinapur. And this goes back to the last chapter where I explained how when Krishna's disappearance pastimes was coming close, he asked all the Yadus, as the ill omens were appearing in Dwarka, then he asked them to all go to Prabhashetra and do some rituals to counteract these omens. And they had gone and they, drank alcohol and they fought with each other. Right? And even, and they all killed each other. And of course, Krishna and Balaram took care of the rest. And so how Daruka suddenly appeared and Krishna asked Daruka to go to and tell Arjuna to take all his wives to Hastinapur. So this is that part of that story where Krishna asked Arjuna to take care of his wives. And so he wanted to do that and he could not because on the way he was defeated by cowherd men. Ordinary cowherd men, so-called ordinary, that he didn't know who they were really. So the story behind it is very interesting, is that who were these cowherd boys? They were actually Krishna. But how did they appear as cowherd boys? The story goes back how these queens were actually the wives of demigods who served Ashtavakra Muni. And Ashtavakra Muni was interesting, as you can see in the slide, he had a very curvy body. He was curved in 8 places. So when he walked, then he would walk in a very funny way. So all these wives of the demigods, they started laughing. First they pleased Ashtavakra Muni and he benedicted them as Krishna as their husband. He said, you can have Krishna as your husband. But later on, when they laughed at him, because he walked in a funny way, then he cursed them to be kidnapped by rogues, but still to get Krishna as their husband. So in order to keep the words of the Muni, Krishna himself kidnapped in the guise of cowherd men. And Arjuna did not know this and he was feeling very minimized. He was thinking, how come I could not protect these queens from these ordinary cowherd men? So it's again, the lesson here is that we should not become proud of what we have. Whatever we have is Krishna has given it to us according to our piety, according to what we deserve. And because very soon we will see that how these very things, if we are very proud, we will find it ourselves, face down, right? Face down. So we should never be, we should always give credit to Krishna for whatever we have and realize that nothing really belongs to us. So in our next slide, we'll talk about how Arjuna feels powerless without Krishna. Notice how in all these verses we are seeing this underlying current of the sentiments of these great devotees, this complete submission, this complete surrender and gratefulness to the Lord. Even at times of their, at times when they are not so favored by Krishna. So it appears, right? Like Draupadi's insult and all these things. Still, these devotees never lose their faith in Krishna and still they surrender. So in text 21, very famous verse, Arjuna is saying, I have this very same Gandiva bow, the same arrows, the same chariot drawn by the same horses, and I use them as the same Arjuna to whom all the kings offered their due respects. But in the absence of Lord Krishna, all of them, at a moment's notice, have become null and void. It is exactly like offering clarified butter on ashes, accumulating money with a magic wand, or sowing seeds on barren land. So this concept we've already discussed, how we should not be proud. It says proud by borrowed plumes, Prabhupada calls that how all energies and powers come from Krishna and they act as long as he wants, as long as he desires, and they cease to function as soon as he withdraws. And the example, which is very nice to discuss with the children, is that how electrical energy is received from the powerhouse. For example, we have a light in the room, a bulb that we turn on, but that energy is coming from the powerhouse. And if the powerhouse stops supplying the energy, the bulbs are of no use, right? So in a moment's time, Krishna can withdraw these energies. It's all coming from him. It's according to Supreme Law. So Prabhupada writes how material civilization without the blessing of the Lord is child's play only. Human civilization and all activities thereof must be dovetailed with the supreme blessing of the Lord. And without this blessing, all advancement of human civilization is like decoration on a dead body. And that's why it's being compared here to like clarified butter on ashes when there's no fire, and the accumulation of money by a magic wand, which is just a dreaming condition, and the sowing of seeds in a barren land. So it's a nice analogy to give that descriptive flavor to our children. Okay. Now in the next slide. And before this, we go to the next slide. Also, Arjuna discusses about the Yadu's demise, right? Which we've already discussed in the last chapter. That I'm not going over that, but how they were intoxicated and how Krishna did that to speed their pastimes of winding his pastimes, and so that all these devotees can go back from where they came. Now, interesting point is that how Prabhupada explains how these Yadus, they were actually demigods. So they were used to drinking wine and fighting with each other. So there, because it becomes very, mind-boggling how Krishna's devotees can act in such a way where they're drinking wine and fighting with each other. But these were in their previous lives were demigods, very special demigods who assisted Krishna in these pastimes. And so they were used to drinking wine, fighting with one another and being intoxicated. Right? So this was already part of their life. They knew that. Okay, so in our next slide, we'll talk about how Arjuna finds solution to his dejection by remembering his instructions. Whose instructions? Krishna's instructions. This was because he's been lamenting and lamenting about Krishna's disappearance. And so was Yudhishthira Maharaj, seeing something like this was going to happen. So I'll read text 27. Now I'm attracted to those instructions imparted to me by the personality of Godhead, Govinda, because they are impregnated with instructions for relieving the burning heart in all circumstances of time and space. And here Prabhupada explains in the purport how Arjuna is referring to the instruction of Bhagavad Gita, which was imparted to him by the Lord on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. The Lord left behind in him the instructions of Bhagavad Gita, not for the benefit of Arjuna alone, but for all time and in all lands. Bhagavad Gita, being spoken by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is the essence of all Vedic wisdom. Then in text 28, Sutta Goswami says, thus being absorbed in thinking of the instructions of the Lord, which were imparted in the great intimacy of friendship, and in thinking of his lotus feet, Arjuna's mind became pacified and freed from all material contamination. Prabhupada writes in the purpose, since the Lord is absolute, deep meditation upon him is as good as yogic trance. Arjuna began to think of the Lord's instructions to him on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Only those instructions began to eliminate the tinges of material contamination in the mind of Arjuna. So Prabhupada compares the Lord like the sun. When the sun appears, everything, all the darkness or ignorance goes away. And how does the sun appear? Is through the Lord Chaitanya's inauguration of the chanting of the holy name. In text 29, Arjuna's constant remembrance of the lotus feet of Lord Shri Krishna rapidly increased his devotion, and as a result, all the trash in his thoughts subsided. So what is this trash? All the material contamination, which separates us from Krishna, which makes us identify with our body. So all that disappears as soon as he started remembering Krishna's instructions in the Bhagavad Gita. Text 30. Because of the Lord's pastimes and activities, and because of his absence, it appeared that Arjuna forgot the instructions left by the personality of Godhead. But factually, this was not the case, and again he became lord of his senses. Text 31. Because of his possessing spiritual assets, the doubts of duality were completely cut off. Thus, he was freed from the three modes of material nature and placed in transcendence. There was no longer any chance of his becoming entangled in birth and death, for he was freed from material form. So Prabhupada explains how by proper consciousness, one can be in the association of Krishna. One doesn't have to make special arrangements for a physical environment. One has to simply change one's consciousness, right? And then he explains about the chanting, how one can, by chanting, can clean the dust from the mirror of the heart. Because as soon as we chant, all the material conception is gradually removed. So one interesting point that Prabhupada writes here is that in the previous ages, the Mahamantra was present as well. Many times this question comes up. Was this Mahamantra there in the other yugas? So here Prabhupada explains, yes, it was there. And it was there with the same potency. But in Kali Yuga, due to distressing situations, one can really take shelter of the holy name. But in other ages, due to lack of distress, people could not take shelter of the holy name. Misery actually brings us closer to Krishna, and we take more shelter of him. So therefore, Arjuna fixed himself in the ambrosia nectar of his words, and thus fixed himself in remembrance of Krishna. And in this way, all his illusory relationships was removed, and he was able to fully associate with Krishna in his remembrance. So, in our next slide, we'll talk about how Yudhishthira Maharaj prepares to leave, followed by his brothers and then his mother Kunti. Text 37. Maharaj Yudhishthira was intelligent enough to understand the influence of the age of Kali, characterized by increasing avarice, falsehood, teaching, and violence throughout the capital, state, home, and among individuals. So he wisely prepared himself to leave home, and he dressed accordingly. And then other texts talk about how he enthroned his grandson. And who was his grandson? The great Parikshit Maharaj, who became king of Hastinapur. And then he posted Vrajara, the son of Aniruddha, as king of Mathura, as a king of Shurasena at Mathura. And then how Maharaj Yudhishthira performed a Prajapatya sacrifice and placed in himself the fire for quitting household life. So he was here, Yudhishthira Maharaj is deliberating and what to think next. And then Kunti, when she also hears that, she also engages her consciousness completely in thoughts of Krishna. And Prabhupada writes how this is the supreme religion. That even though we are in this material world, we should be always, our consciousness should be, diverted towards Krishna. In other words, we actually have to give our hearts to Krishna. We can do everything else. We can do our duty. We can have a great affection for our family members, but our heart should be reserved for Krishna. And this is the great quality of these devotees. Their heart was always for Krishna and for Krishna alone. But they did everything else. You can see how well they did everything else. And there was no lack of affection among each other either. But how can one have both? That's the question, right? How can one have so much affection and such, for each other and such ideal, relationships? Even materially, I mean, they're so exemplary that we can learn so much in their behavior with each other. But yet, they were such great devotees. How do these things work together? And this is the secret: is that we do everything. We see everybody as soul. Even our children, our husbands, we see them as spirit souls, and we do our duty towards them nicely. But then our hearts should be reserved for Krishna. We should understand that how the soul, like in one of the slides we talked about, how Krishna is most dear to the soul. Nobody is dearer than Krishna. Why? Because we are part and parcel of him. And unless we give our hearts to Krishna, we actually will never be happy. So in text 40, Maharaj Yudhishthira says, at once he relinquished all his garments, belt and ornaments of the royal order and became completely disinterested and unattached to everything. So Prabhupada writes in the purport how Maharaj Yudhishthira, therefore, to become spiritually pure, at once gave up his royal opulence, relinquishing his royal dress and garments. The shaya, or the saffron loincloth of a sannyasi, indicates freedom from all attractive material garments, and thus he changed his dress accordingly. He became disinterested in his kingdom and family, and thus became free from all material contamination or material designation. People are generally attached to various kinds of designations: the designations of family, society, country, occupation, wealth, position, and many others. As long as one is attached to such designation, he is considered materially impure. The so-called leaders of men in the modern age are attached by national consciousness, but they do not know that such false consciousness is also another designation of the materially conditioned souls. One has to relinquish such designations before one can become eligible to go back to Godhead. Foolish people adore such men who die in national consciousness. But here is an example of Maharaj Yudhishthira, a royal king who prepared himself to leave this world without such national consciousness. And yet he is remembered even today because he was a great pious king, almost on the same level as the personality of God as Sri Rama. And because people of the world were dominated by such pious kings, they were happy in all respects, and it was quite possible for such great emperors to rule the world. So ruling the world is not a small thing. One has to be, practically one has to be, almost as good as God. So in our next slide, we'll talk about Vidura's departure. Just a little explanation about him, because we've been hearing about Vidura, how Duryodhana had insulted him, and so he had left the palace and he had gone for 20 years on pilgrimage, and then he met Maitreya Rishi and took instructions from him. And the entire third and fourth canto, we hear of his questions to Maitreya Muni. Right? So, and then he actually goes back to Hastinapur, delivers Dhritarashtra, which we heard in chapter 13 when he comes back after hearing from Maitreya Muni. He's so fired up because he's seen one after another. He's seeing different stories. He's heard from Maitreya Muni the story of Prithu Maharaj, how wonderful way he ruled, but then he left the world in such an exemplary way, and other great kings, Dhruva Maharaj. as well in the 4th canto. So in this way, Vidura came back to Hastinapur, delivered Dhritarashtra, and then he left again. And then he prepared for his journey back home, back to Godhead. And when he, in text 49, it says that when he was absorbed in thought of Krishna, and he was received by the denizens of Pitraloka, where he returned to his original post as Yamaraj. He was Yamaraj, and you heard that, how he was actually Yamaraj, but he was cursed by Manduka Muni to become Vidura. So Prabhupada writes how the difference between the Pandavas and Vidura is that Pandavas are eternal associates of the Lord, whereas Vidura is one of the administrative demigods in charge of Pitraloka planet, and he is known as Yamaraj. So even though Yamaraj is known as one of the demigods, he's not an ordinary demigod. He's actually a very, very great soul, great personality, a pure devotee of the Lord, who awards punishment to the miscreants of the world, mature world, but those who are devotees, they have nothing to fear from him. To devotees, he's a cordial friend, but to the non-devotees, he's fear personified. Okay. Some interesting thing that Prabhupada writes here is that how the demigods are associates of the Lord without personal touch, whereas direct associates of the Lord, whereas the direct associates of the Lord are in constant personal touch with him. So demigods are also very empowered beings. And there's different categories of demigods as well. So in our last slide, we're going to talk about how Draupadi and Subhadra leave without help from their great husbands. Okay, that's verse 50. Draupadi also saw that her husbands, without caring for her, were leaving alone. She knew well about Lord Vasudeva, Krishna, and the personality of Godhead. Both she and Subhadra became absorbed in thoughts of Krishna and attained the same results as their husbands. And very interesting purport, where Prabhupada writes, when flying an airplane, one cannot take care of other planes. Everyone has to take care of his own plane. And if there's any danger, no other plane can help another in that condition. Similarly, at the end of life, when one has to go back home, back to Godhead, everyone has to take care of himself without help rendered by another. The help is, however, offered on the ground before flying in space. Similarly, the spiritual master, the father, the mother, the relatives, the husband, and others can all render help during one's lifetime. But while crossing the sea, one has to take care of himself and utilize the instructions formally received. Draupadi had 5 husbands, and no one asked Draupadi to come. Draupadi had to take care of herself without waiting for her great husbands. And because she was already trained, she at once took to concentration upon the lotus feet of Lord Vasudeva, Krishna, the personality of Godhead. In other words, wives and women have to also train themselves. And we see that in Shastra, Devahuti, the mother of Kapila Muni, she was, and husband, a wife of Karda Muni, she was so well trained that when Karda Muni left, she knew exactly what to do and also what to ask, the right questions to ask from her son. She was totally prepared. The wives also got the same result as their husbands in the same manner. That is to say, without changing their bodies, they reached the destination of Godhead. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur suggests that both Draupadi and Subhadra, although her name is not mentioned herein, got the same result. None of them had to quit the body. Last text. The subject of the departure of the sons of Pandu for the ultimate goal of life, back to Godhead, is fully auspicious and is perfectly pure. Therefore, anyone who hears this narration with devotional faith certainly gains the devotional service of the Lord, the highest perfection of life. So I end my overview here. Thank you very much, and I'll give it over to Radhika to explain the activities in the guidebook.
Thank you. That was a really amazing, detailed, in-depth overview of the chapter. Thank you, Mataji. Really benefit from hearing Canto and you. Okay, I'm ready with my PowerPoint. Okay, so now that we have studied the translations with our children from Prabhupada's Bhagavatam, we're ready to move on to a comprehensive guide for young readers. And chapter 15 begins, like all chapters in the book, with a story summary. King Yudhishthira had asked his younger brother, Prince Arjuna, so many questions about why he was so sad, but Arjuna had still not said a word. He couldn't. Arjuna was just too sad to speak. He was really upset. He was so upset that his mouth was all dry, even his heart was dry, and as a result, his skin had lost its color. Arjuna's eyes had filled up with tears. He was really trying not to cry, but he couldn't help remembering how Lord Krishna had always looked after him. So really beautiful flow of the story, very easy for children to follow. And we move on further to key messages from the chapter that nicely groups verses, and they're not all in sequence. So, like the theme of the strength of the strong goes on from verses 7 to 16 and then 20 to 21. And then the key messages are summarized. So there's a really nice overview of the chapter, and there's an encouragement here for the children to memorize these verses, discuss them further, and followed by multiple choice questions to understand the story. Why were Arjuna's eyes filled with tears? A, because he was tired after the long journey. B, because Lord Krishna had returned to the spiritual world. Or C, because he was missing Dhritarashtra and Vidura. So there are 13 questions with 3 choices each, and really fun for them to understand this particular chapter. Higher thinking questions that can be discussed orally or provided as a writing assignment. List 3 things that Arjuna was able to achieve because of the presence of Lord Krishna with him. Write in your own words the story of how Durvasa Muni was satisfied by the Pandavas. So they're learning composition, and they're learning grammar and punctuation and writing skills. Some other thoughtful questions that are perhaps not directly answered, but really make the child think, such as, why did the mighty Yadu dynasty end? Explain your understanding. Or why did the Pandavas go to Goloka Vrindavan and Vidura to Pitraloka, even though all of them were absorbed in thoughts of Krishna? So it really helps to delve into Prabhupada's purpose. And then we move on to fun activities. So there it starts with an analogy activity to bring out the scholar in you. The source of energy using stringed lights. So in the purport to verse 21, Prabhupada speaks of, as we have discussed more than once, one should not be puffed up by borrowed plumes. All energies and powers are derived from the Supreme Source, Lord Krishna, and they act as long as he desires and cease to function as soon as he withdraws. All electrical energies are received from the powerhouse, and as soon as the powerhouse stops supplying energy, the bulbs are of no use. In a moment's time, such energies can be generated or withdrawn by the supreme will of the Lord. So the learning objectives are to understand that Krishna is the source of everything, understand that electrical items need a power supply to work. It's not just that the bulb functions on its own, and understand what activities are conducive to spiritual life. And so the resource that's required is stringed lights. And get a string of lights. In this, it says, please make sure you have an adult with you, or the adult does this. And decorate a door with these lights. Or alternatively, use a lamp or other light source and plug it into the socket, turn the switch on, and the lights turn on. Now turn them off, and the lights turn off. So what happens to the lights when you take the plug out of the socket? How does this compare to what happened if the universe's power source, Krishna, ceases powering everything? And what would it feel like if Krishna was not in your life? Discuss what makes good conductors electricity, what activities are helpful for spiritual life. So, ultimately discussing that Krishna is the source of everything. Without him, not even a blade of grass moves. And without Krishna, our lives would be dark, bleak, and meaningless. So really nice Prabhupada's purpose into life, into action. Introspective activity that encourages the children to think about their strengths and interests. So identify your strengths and interests and dovetail these in the service of Krishna. So in the 5th purport, Arjuna said, O king, the supreme personality of Godhead, who treated me like an intimate friend, has left me alone. Thus my astounding power is no longer with me. So we can learn from this verse that any power, beauty, strength is given by Lord Krishna, and we should not become proud of these borrowed plumes. So the child is encouraged, and there's a space in the workbook to make a list of strengths that they have and things that they like to do, and how the child can use these to serve Krishna. So, and also the exercise says the child can draw if the child is not old enough to write. A snap game. This is a game for 2 or more players. So there's snap cards given in resource 1, and they're to be printed and then cut out and then shuffle them and place them face down in the center. And each player takes turn to pick the top card and then place in a separate pile, the word side up, reading it as they do. And when a synonym appears for the previous word, they should say snap and put it on top of the other card and keep a score of how many snaps were correctly said by the player. So I can show you resource 1, but there's also a farewell letter where the child is encouraged to write a farewell letter from any one of the Pandavas to their family and friends as they are leaving. So here's, oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had the cards. Maybe it's not in order. Okay, here's resource 1. I apologize. I didn't put it in order. So these are the snap cards, and there are a bunch of them. So there are a few pages that give these snap cards. And again, the encouragement is to learn the synonyms for words. So it's a really nice way to learn English language arts. Okay, write a biography of one of the characters in this chapter. And it explains what a biography is, and the child is encouraged to conduct research on that person's life. And, you know, this is not Google research, it's research through the Srimad Bhagavatam. So reading different sections of the Bhagavatam or Mahabharata, and finding out where they were born, what's their family background, what kind of adjectives would you use to describe their personality, what kind of achievements did they have, and adding an illustration and a cover to make the biography complete. Keywords. So these words are to be looked up in a dictionary and then write their definition on these lines. And again, you know, we're more and more moving away from dictionaries, it seems, and a lot of children don't even have those skills of like alphabetically searching a word, but it's a really, really important skill to be able to go to a dictionary rather than a Google dictionary and look up these words. And there's an extension activity in this particular chapter. So something new is added on to the keywords, which is synonyms. Synonyms are words that have the same or nearly the same meaning. So read these words from the summary and then try to come up with a synonym, and you know, always can take the help of the dictionary. Further extension activities, use each word in a sentence of your own, oral or written. Cryptogram, really fun way to bring the Bhagavatam to life, isn't it? Like, you know, children do cryptograms in other areas of life, in science or social studies, but here it is from the Bhagavatam. The shaded section right here is the key that lists all the letters from A to Z with a corresponding number. And then there's a secret phrase here, and you have to decode it. So 22 is A, 16 is R. So, you know, that first word you can tell is Arjuna. So nice cryptogram. Synonyms. Fill in the blanks, oral or written, by selecting a word from the synonyms to complete the sentences below. Mosaic fish. This is an artistic activity. Arjuna mentioned that all his accomplishments had been due to Krishna's friendship and protection. One of these achievements was when he won Draupadi's hand in marriage. So make a mosaic fish by drawing a simple fish in a cardstock, fill it in by tearing colorful pieces of paper from a magazine or a calendar, or, you know, origami papers, or any kind of, you know, recycled materials, cartons of cereal boxes, or whatever other boxes that are used in the house, and glue them to make a fish. While completing this activity, think about how Arjuna won Draupadi's hand in marriage, and where does the fish come into this pastime? Okay, amazing maze. So help the Pandavas get back home, back to Godhead by completing the maze, back to Krishna. And then one can also create their own maze by using straws, glue, scissors, cardboard, marker pen, or a marble. And there's a whole description of how to draw the maze. Followed by a beautiful poem. Okay, so I guess I didn't put the maze in the right place either. So here's the maze. Resource 2 gives a simple maze to help the Pandavas get back to Lord. And this one is more complicated for older children to find the Pandavas' way back to Krishna. So there are two versions of that provided. Okay, the Pandavas retired timely. Love the poems in each chapter. 5 Pandava brothers going back to the Lord. There are 5 Pandava brothers going back to the Lord. They missed him so much, he's the one they adored. There are 5 Pandava brothers going back to the Lord. Yudhishthira asked Arjuna, hey, why are you sad? He said, Krishna has left us, so I'm feeling bad. I miss him so much, he is my best friend. So soon have his pastimes come to an end. He was our savior, oh so very dear. With him around, we never felt fear. I feel oh so helpless, no, it's not the same. With my same bow and arrows, I still can't take aim. So the whole theme of Krishna as a source of all our power is brought out in this nice poem. Yudhishthira said, I'm going, Parikshit's now king. He took off his robes and he left everything. He thought of Lord Krishna and boldly went forth, passing rivers and mountains as he headed north. Bhim and Arjuna, Nakul and Sahadev, seeing him going, they felt very grave. They thought of Lord Krishna and followed his route, absorbed in the Lord and the sound of his flute. Draupadi said, they're going, now I have to leave. We'll think of the Lord and his dear lotus feet. They went back to Krishna, and there they will stay. By hearing these pastimes, you'll get there one day. Already? And answers. I have not been receiving any questions about how to get these books, so I'm assuming everybody knows that you can get these books via Amazon in the US or UK, as well as through Media. And that is the chapter from the Comprehensive Guide for Young Readers. So please ask questions. It would be really nice if you could raise your hand using the Zoom tool so that way I can call on you and you can unmute and ask your question yourself. Any questions, devotees? Otherwise, we might have to come to an end in a few minutes. Okay. Archana Mataji from Pune, please. Oops, I'm sorry.
Hare Krishna, Mataji. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, Hare Krishna, Mataji. Thank you so much for a nice summary. Mataji, I'm not sure how to understand the pastimes where Draupadi actually rudely says to Karna that he's not a Kshatriya, so she won't marry. And a few others like getting intoxicated by the yadus, and also even like Lord Balaram drinking the Varuni nectar, getting intoxicated. So all such pastimes, how do we understand in a way, and also how do we discuss that with the children?
Yes. So regarding Draupadi's, insult, I think that was your first one, isn't that right? How to see that in terms of no, what regarding Draupadi? What was your question regarding Draupadi? I forget. What was the question about Draupadi, Archana?
She was asking about Draupadi insulting Karna, how to understand
Karna, yes. Yes. So Karna was he was actually son of Kunti. We all know that, right? But because Kunti gave him up without anybody knowing it, he was adopted by a cow. He was a carpenter's son, right? So therefore, he was not eligible to take part. This was Draupadi's excuse to get married to Arjuna. Because she knew that if there was anybody who would defeat Arjuna, it would be Karna. So she wanted, and these are the pastimes of the great devotees. We have to understand who Draupadi is. She's not an ordinary woman. And so again, we have to see it from the light of Krishna's desire and Krishna's pastimes. Especially it's very heart-rending in the Mahabharata to see how Karna was, how being Kunti's sons, yet he was he was on the other side. That was his choice, his independent will, when he went to the side of Duryodhana. And Krishna is showing through these pastimes is that if a devotee, he opts for the wrong thing, then he has to suffer a reaction, Just like Bhishma, he was such a great devotee, but because he went on the other side, he had to take the brunt of it. Okay. So even though these devotees are not ordinary, they are actually even Karna was a very, very great personality, very, very great soul. But yet, because in this pastime, they're taking the side of the wrong side, then Krishna had to bring the right result for them. Because Krishna is teaching in two ways, his internal reasons why he's doing certain things, with his pure devotees, his pastimes, his desire, his will, of how that nobody can question, and also his, how he sometimes desires to fight. So Jaya and Vijaya become Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha. That's Krishna's own desire. And then we deal with how Krishna is teaching us through these pastimes. So if we see these two aspects and we see how, even though it feels so wrong, it feels so wrong and so unjustified, yet materially speaking, it feels so unjustified. But Krishna is teaching us a deeper reason of how that we all have independent will. And if we choose the wrong side, then the wrong result will be there. Now, Karna just acted superficially just because Duryodhana was the only one who took his side. And Duryodhana was very cunning. He befriended Karna because he knew he was very valuable. So he was acting out of a selfish reason when he extended his hand to Karna, you see. So he didn't have a pure heart. So all these drama is being played. So Krishna is showing, yes, materially, Karna felt obliged to him, but yet he should have seen the higher picture. He should have seen how the Pandavas was such glorified souls. So this is my answer. I know if anybody else has it's a deeper insight, another insight into it, and a deeper one, please share. No problem with that. Okay.
Thank you, Mataji.
Yes. So regarding other pastimes of Krishna, how to understand them, right? In terms of which one was the other one? I should have written it down. I didn't bring a pencil here.
Yeah. So it's the getting intoxicated. The descendants of Krishna getting intoxicated, or like even when Lord Balaram, sometimes he gets intoxicated with the Varuni, all of those.
Very good. Yeah, this comes up very much, and I remember the first reading it and then getting quite confused by that. How can Krishna's pure devotees behave like that? How can they get intoxicated? And so when I just in the class, when I mentioned about how Prabhupada explains that, is how they were previously demigods and how they were already, used to drinking and getting intoxicated. But we have to remember the drinking among them is a little different from the drinking here. It's a little different. So because they are more, the enjoyment is more on a subtle level rather than a gross level that we find here. So they're used to this, and these demigods. So when these were yadus who were previously demigods, so they drank and they fought, just like they were used to in the demigod planets. And again, like I said, the two aspects where we can't question Krishna's, desire, where Krishna is acting, this is his desire, this is how he wants to end the pastime, that we actually cannot question. But this is how he wants us to see how, well, for us mundane people who are not like the Pandavas, we see it that, okay, this is what drinking, when you drink, this is what happens, right? You get intoxicated and you may even kill each other. And this happens in the world all the time. So we have to be very careful. And in the pastime, the Yadus, another thing we read is when they offended these sages who were sitting there and making a joke, where they, Sambha, he dressed, as a pregnant woman and he made ridicule them, right? So all these things, so many lessons are there for us to learn, how drinking has bad effects. Regarding Balram, Lord Balram drinking, well, this pastime is, again, he's drinking a special drink called Varuni. And again, Krishna, how in the material world, like the banyan tree is explained in the Bhagavad Gita, the concept of the banyan tree, how whatever is top in the spiritual world is bottom here, in the material world. And whatever is top in the material world is bottom. I mean, it's not considered is very gross. It's not high in the spiritual life, right? So in other words, when we, the paramour relationship in the spiritual world is considered very elevated, whereas in the material world it's degraded, right? So in the same way, drinking is totally, people highlight it as one of the greatest wonderful things, and harmless, but yet it's not, it's very degraded. But when Lord Balram drinks, it's very transcendental, Balram is, even Lord Nityananda, his eyes are always rolling, and this is like ecstasy of love of Godhead. So they're not getting intoxicated in a mundane way, but they're actually getting intoxicated with love of God. Anybody wants to explain in any other way? This is how I understand. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you, Mataji.
Okay.
Thank you for joining every week, Archana Mataji. Adi Gaurangi Mataji, please ask your question. Okay, we can't hear you. Okay, perhaps we can come back to you. Ankur Prabhu from, okay, sorry. So Adi Gaurangi Mataji sends a question because of her technical difficulties, which I'm sure her children can help her with. Can you explain how the Pandavas physically leave their bodies?
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Well, the way I understand from this chapter is that the Pandavas went in the self-same bodies. They actually didn't change their bodies. So they left, and they, from what I understand from these chapters, is that the Pandavas, they simply live in their own same bodies and they go to another universe to continue with their pastimes. Just continuously enacting these pastimes with Krishna, these pastimes of association with Krishna that we are hearing in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So they never stop engaging in these pastimes. So they just simply go from one universe to another. So they live in their self-same bodies. It's interesting how Prabhupada writes in one of the purports is that how in Varna ashrams, some people, they believe, especially the caste brahmanas, they believe that actually you cannot get liberated unless you go through different varnas, through different ashrams. So you have to, if you're a Shudra, then you have to go to Vaishya and then to Kshatriya and then to Brahmanas. And then only you can get liberated. But here we see in the Srimad Bhagavatam that is refuted time and again. How devotees, Vidura, he was born a Shudra from a Shudra mother, and he goes back, to, he's completely is purified and goes back to Pitraloka. So the same thing, so in this way, Pandavas were Kshatriyas, and they did not have to even change their bodies. So that's a side point, but this is how I understand.
So her follow-up is, do their bodies just disappear from our view?
Yes.
Does the spiritual plane, carry them?
Yeah, they disappear from our vision. They disappear from our vision. Just like Krishna showed his pastimes of disappearance, by being struck with a hunter, a hunter's arrow. But, so he was not shot, and obviously there was no death due to that. This is his pastime, how he disappears. Same thing, we don't actually see how they disappear. And if we do understand how they disappear, again, is a pastime that enables them to disappear from our vision, basically.
So she says, that's a special blessing. Thank you. Thank you also for just joining us every week and keeping us inspired to do these presentations. Ankur Agarwal Prabhu from Delhi.
Hare Krishna Mataji, so much for such a wonderful presentation and session. As always, I'm feeling very delighted. I have 7 questions in mind. One of them being, when these, when we talk about the Pandavas, so they are the empowered associates of the Lord, and they, they are, part of all the Leelas. So I was, once listening to one of the lectures, when got to know that, Yudhishthira Maharaj is someone's incarnation, even Duryodhan someone's incarnation. So all the characters are, they are incarnations of something, or someone else. So when such people, or specifically let's talk about Vidur Maharaj. So when Vidurji, when Yamraj comes as Vidura here on this planet, so does he expand himself in, and he's in the both the places simultaneously, or is it that he just comes, perform works here, and whatever was so just completes that period on the earth and then goes back and then resumes the work. Mm-hmm. So how does really happens, and how do we explain such things to the children?
Yeah. So sometimes, like in the case of Vidura, we see that how he was cursed, so he came. Actually, the internal reason was that he had a great desire to actually take part in, to be participant in Krishna's pastimes, in some way or the other, to experience that. He actually gets tired of his service, of always punishing, dealing with the miscreants. Okay. It's actually the hardest service one can have, right? As a pure devotee of the Lord, to see all the entities suffering and to give them punishment. So he needed a break. And so he got that break. So, and during that time, I believe another person was officiating there, right? So that's, sometimes it's explained like that. Okay. And sometimes it's, so because he had a desire, and so he wanted to come here. And sometimes, like Prahlad, he also, they say that Prahlad was also, in Chaitanya Leela, he was Govinda Ghosh, right? Vasudev Dutt. And so we see, sometimes they also come in different personalities. So the way we understand this is that Krishna, he can expand, right? He can expand into so many different forms. And of course, Krishna is all powerful, all pervading. Yes. He can simultaneously do that. Pure devotees also, he also gives them the special powers, while sometimes they actually simultaneously do things. It's so amazing how Krishna will give everything, all the powers, almost as good as himself, to his pure devotees. So they can even go simultaneously in two different forms. So we should understand this also in that respect, that actually the pure devotees also can get almost as powerful as Krishna, because Krishna empowers them with that power. Okay. Is that okay?
Mataji, one more question. Yes, that really answers the question. One more question, if you allow, I would like to ask. When Pandavas leave this body, so it is generally understood, as if the reading was correct, that they go to the heaven. While since they were the so dear devotees of the Lord, so they should have gone to the spiritual. They should have gone back to the spiritual world. So, which one is the correct understanding of the two?
So your question is that why they did not go back to the spiritual world? They did. They actually did. I mean, we don't know the details.
Yes.
Yeah, you see? So they did go to the spiritual world, but then they are ready to do the next pastimes. Wherever Krishna wants them to go in another universe. They are residents of Vaikuntha Loka at all times. So they're eternal residents of Vaikuntha. So they did go back to Godhead.
Okay.
Yeah. But then they are always busy enacting pastimes with their Lord. This is how the Lord wants them to be. And so they surrender to that and they love it. Because for these devotees, we've heard again and again, isn't it, that how they're willing to even go to hell. Because as long they are always so absorbed in the thought of Krishna, for them, heaven and hell, it doesn't matter where they are. Okay?
Right. True. Thank you, madam.
Yes.
I'm not seeing any other questions right now. We can give a couple more minutes.
Okay. Radhika, I forgot to mention to you that next weekend, we may have to, if you're okay, we can have it on Sunday because I have a seminar on Saturday.
Yes. Okay. Archana Mataji has another question. Please ask away.
Hare Krishna Mataji. We are right now. I'm reading Mahabharata with my daughter. We haven't gone to Srimad Bhagavatam yet, but she's really into the Amachutakrata's comic Mahabharata.
Yes.
Where she asked me a question where when Duryodhana was born, there were bad omens or all that going on, and even Vidura suggested to Dhritarashtra that you have 100 sons, so you can actually, just for the sake of the Kuru Vamsa, you could abandon him. But then Dhritarashtra was too attached to the baby, so he didn't want to let go of Duryodhana. So my daughter was asking me how, are some people born bad, and is there a way Duryodhana could have actually reformed and become a devotee, become a nice person, his right from the birth he was very he exhibited some cunningness, or and there were always a negative tinge to his character. So for a child, how do we explain such such differences in characters?
Yes. Well, like this story, this was really the desire of the Lord. When Krishna wants to show something very powerful, the character of Pandavas versus the character of the Kauravas, then he has to engage many people in that Leela. So this is a very powerful story, and Krishna wanted to engage personalities like Dhritarashtra and Duryodhana to highlight, how people who are against Krishna, what is their fate, and by that he's also highlighting the great qualities of pure devotees. So Duryodhana's, how he was born, just like Jai and Vijay, they were born as Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu. Well, from day one, there was nothing really that could have been done. I mean, they were just like demons. As soon as Diti was pregnant with them, they were already really horrible omens. and everybody was terrified, even when they didn't even come out, right? So what do we do with that? It's because this is, again, Krishna is going through is going to show through this pastime of Jay and Vijay fall down, and the incarnation as Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha, he's going to teach us very important lessons. The lessons of Prahlad Maharaj's story is, these are lessons that even Lord Chaitanya heard hundreds of times, and he did not get tired of them. So these are eternal, very eternal stories meant for us to learn from. Okay, so these are very special stories, and and many times and you notice how in the story of Mahabharata, how Vidura tried to change Dhritarashtra, but Duryodhana, everybody knew that there was no hope with him, so he was always considered, a demon, demoniac qualities, So this is how I understand, again.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you. Okay, we'll wait for other questions. Okay, doesn't look like there's anything else, Mataji.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for all these wonderful questions. And thank you for being such a good audience. And we'll meet again, and it's possible that we'll meet on Sunday. So please stay tuned in the WhatsApp group. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Mataji. Hare Krishna. Wish you Gaur Purnima in advance, Mataji.
Hare Krishna, all of you. Happy Gaur Purnima coming up tomorrow. Hare Krishna.